Why is death so troubling? Well, because it's me that dies. But who or what am I? A central theme of the Upanishads, a collection of texts from ancient India, is that we are radically mistaken about the nature of the self. A true sage comes to recognize that this individual ego is not the self, and comes to identify with a much greater whole.
What did the sage say to the hot dog vendor?
What?
Make me one with everything.
The Upanishads are a collection of texts composed over several centuries in the middle of the first millennium BCE that stand as the earliest overtly philosophical texts in the Indian tradition. You have a series of dialogues and speeches and poems that in various ways explore the nature of reality and the nature of the self and much else besides. The Katha Upanishad has a particularly striking framing narrative. It tells the story of a boy, Naciketas, who annoys his father, and his father sends him down to death. And Naciketas comes before Yama, the Lord of Death, who grants him 3 wishes. And for his first wish, Naciketas asks that he might be reconciled with his father. And Yama says, sure, I can do that for you. For his second wish, Naciketas asks if Yama will teach him about the rituals by which one can gain entry into heaven, how one can gain a favorable rebirth. And again, Yama accepts, agrees, tells him what to do. And then Naciketas says, what happens after death? Does a person continue to exist after death? And Yama says, you can't ask me that. Ask me any other question you want. And Naciketas's answer is interesting. He says that once you've confronted the problem of death, all of the other blessings seem irrelevant. So he's already got, you might say, an earthly reward in the sense that he's been granted something in this life, and he's been granted a heavenly reward. He's been told how to guarantee a favorable rebirth. But to his mind, neither of these things are that important in the face of death. And so he insists that Yama give him the teaching about death. And what follows in the remainder of the Katha Upanishad is this teaching. Now, in fact, most of the Katha Upanishad deals with the nature of the self. And this is a common theme in a lot of ancient Indian thought, both in the Upanishads as well as in the Buddhist tradition, that we are not just wrong about the way things are or wrong about the way that the self is, but radically wrong, that we fundamentally misunderstand the nature of reality, that we're living under a veil of illusion. And that illusion is centrally concerned with a misunderstanding of the self, of Ātman is the Sanskrit word for the self. And in particular, there's a tendency to associate the self with a physical body and with the ego, with its desires and its sense perceptions. And what you see in the Katha Upanishad, which echoes other texts in the Upanishads, is a turning away from the world of the senses, the world of desire, the world of the physical body, and turning inward. A recognition that behind all of my sense experiences, there is an experiencer. And that experiencer is itself very hard to come into any clear contact with, precisely because we're accustomed to understanding the world in terms of what we can see and touch and taste and so on. It's much harder to get a clear view of the ground of that seeing, that touching, that tasting, the self that is the source of all of these things. But the Katha Upanishad urges us to direct our attention inward so that we can come to a clearer understanding of the true nature of the self. One of the most striking and distinctive ideas in the Upanishads, and we encounter this in the Katha Upanishad among others, is the equation of Ātman with Brahman. So Ātman, as I said, is the self. Brahman is, you might say, the universal principle of ultimate reality, the oneness of all things. That underlying the diversity of things in the world, there is an underlying oneness, and that is Brahman. And the suggestion then is that when we truly recognize what the self is, we recognize that the self is not some distinct individual separate from everything else, but that individuality dissolves into the oneness of Brahman. So in one striking simile in the Katha Upanishad, the self is likened to the wind. That, I might experience the wind blowing here, you might experience the wind blowing there. We have different experiences of different aspects of the wind, but it's all one wind. It's not as if there are different winds in different places. There's just the air circulating all over the world. And likewise, I might have the experience of being an individual self here, and you might have the experience of being an individual self over there. But really, we're all just aspects of this one great self. And the goal of spiritual enlightenment is to come to recognize that, to come to identify oneself with Brahman, to see that there is no distinct individuality when we see reality at its most fundamental level. So what does this have to do with death? It's one of the interesting things, I think, about the Katha Upanishad, that you have this opening dialogue between Naciketas and Yama on the nature of death. And then what you end up getting is a discourse on the self. And there are mentions of death along the way. We're told that if the killer thinks that he is killed, if the killed person thinks he has been killed, both are mistaken because both fail to recognize the nature of the self. But the thought is something like this, that to the extent that we think about death, what we're talking about is the death of the self. That we care about this not because the body somehow falls apart, but because I die, because I am gone. My ego, myself, is at stake when I'm talking about death. And so the Upanishad argument that the true self is not this individual ego, but Brahman, is a way of answering our concern about death. That sure, this individual body, this individual ego might pass away, but the thought is, if I understand properly the nature of reality, and in particular if I understand properly the nature of the self, I will recognize that true self, Ātman as Brahman, is immortal and cannot die. And that's why the killer and the killed are both mistaken in thinking that death has happened there. Because ultimately, everything is part of this universal existence that is immortal. And so that is the way in which the Katha Upanishad presents an answer to Naciketas' concern about death. And what's interesting is that this is a different kind of answer from the kind of answer that he asks about with regard to a favorable rebirth. So what we find in the Katha Upanishad and many texts in this period is an idea of reincarnation as part of a cycle of death and rebirth, known as samsara. And the typical idea is that we live a life, we die, and then we're reborn in another form. And a lot of the traditional Vedic rituals of ancient India are designed in order to win ourselves a favorable rebirth. But that idea of a favorable rebirth is still tied to the idea of an individual self that is looking to you might say, win out in the cycle of samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth. But the goal that is advocated in the Katha Upanishad is what's known as moksha, as liberation. Not to win a favorable rebirth, but to escape from the cycle of death and rebirth altogether through the dissolution of a sense of individuality that is ultimately the only way to overcome death. That as long as we're constantly reborn, we're constantly dying again and again and again. And the way to free ourselves from death is to free ourselves from the illusion of the individual self. Total liberation from the bonds of the ego and freedom from the cycle of death and rebirth sounds great. But as a second best option, you could try liking this video or following my YouTube channel.
It's Ātman-tastic.